"You paid, I'm here," said the 7-foot mail-order bride to the terrified mountain man. He thought he was safe, hidden away in the snowy mountains, until a towering bride stepped off a wagon and claimed him as her husband. At first, he wanted nothing to do with her. But when the townsfolk mocked her, and railroad men came hunting for the spring on his land, everything changed. This wasn't just a marriage by paper. It was a fight for dignity, for faith, and for the very water that gave life to the valley. But when fire consumed the church and blood was spilled, he sent her away, believing he was cursed. Alone in the wilderness, could he truly let go of the one miracle he'd been given? As greed closes in and the valley prepares for war, will a broken mountain man stand with the giant bride who vowed to save him, or lose her forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The dawn light crept over the snow-laden Colorado mountains, painting the pristine white landscape in shades of pink and gold. Inside his rough-hewn cabin, Noel Boone stirred the dying embers of last night's fire, watching as orange sparks danced upward through the stone chimney. His calloused hands worked mechanically, adding kindling and small logs until the flames caught and spread their warmth through the single room. The familiar routine brought little comfort this morning. Something felt different in the air, unsettled, like the stillness before a storm. Noel shrugged off the feeling and pulled on his heavy wool coat. The traps wouldn't check themselves. He had just reached for his hat when an unfamiliar sound broke the morning quiet, the distinct crunch of wagon wheels on snow. Noel froze, his hand hovering above the peg where his hat hung. Nobody came up this high in winter, not unless they were lost or looking for trouble. Either way, it meant complications he didn't need. The sound grew closer, accompanied by the steady clip-clop of horse hooves. Noel moved to the window, his movements cautious and practiced. Through the frost-rimmed glass, he watched a freight wagon emerge from the tree line, its wooden wheels cutting deep tracks in the fresh snow. The wagon drew to a halt about 20 yards from his cabin. The driver, bundled against the cold in a heavy buffalo coat, set the brake with a loud creak. But it was the passenger who caught and held Noel's attention. She emerged from beneath the wagon's canvas cover like a ship's mast unfurling, tall and straight and seemingly endless. The woman stood at least 7 feet if she was an inch, her dark cloak dusted with snow, her red hair escaping from beneath a practical wool bonnet. She moved with a deliberate grace that belied her size, stepping down from the wagon without hesitation. Noel's breath caught in his throat. A forgotten memory stirred. A night of too much whiskey, a letter written in a moment of desperate loneliness, coins passed across a bar to a traveling preacher who promised to send it east to a reputable marriage agency. He had convinced himself it was just a drunken dream. The knock, when it came, was firm and confident. Noel opened the door slowly, looking up, something he rarely had to do, into clear green eyes set in a face that managed to be both strong and gentle. "Mr. Noel Boone?" Her voice carried a hint of Ireland in its lilt, but was as steady as mountain bedrock. Without waiting for his response, she reached into her cloak and withdrew an envelope, holding it out like a declaration of intent. "You paid. I'm here." Noel took the letter with numb fingers, recognizing his own rough handwriting on the outer fold. "There must be some mistake," he muttered, even as the memory of writing those words became clearer with each passing moment. No mistake. Magnolia Quinn, for this must be her, stood. Straight and tall, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. The church agency in Boston was quite specific. You requested a bride willing to live in the mountains, someone strong enough for frontier life. A small smile touched her lips. "Well, here I am." The wagon driver chose that moment to clear his throat. "Miss Quinn's trunk is in the back. Where would you like it, sir?" Noel opened his mouth, closed it again, then managed to croak out, "There's been a misunderstanding. I'm not... That letter," Maggie interrupted calmly, "was a binding contract, Mr. Boone. You paid the agency fee. I sold my family's farm in Massachusetts to make the journey. The agreement is legal and proper. She pulled another document from her cloak. I have the papers here, signed by Reverend Matthews himself. The wagon driver shifted impatiently on his seat. Sir? The trunk? Noel looked from the driver to Maggie, then at the heavy snow clouds gathering overhead. Whatever his protests, he couldn't leave a woman standing in the snow, even one who towered over him. His mama, rest her soul, would rise from her grave to tan his hide. Round back, he said finally, gesturing toward the cabin's rear door. There's a covered storage area. The driver nodded, clearly relieved to be moving. He guided his team around the cabin while Noel stood rooted to the spot, still trying to process this turn of events. Maggie remained where she was, apparently content to wait out his internal struggle. The sound of the trunk being unloaded broke the spell. Noel stepped back, holding the door wider. You'd best come in. Storm's brewing. Maggie ducked her head slightly to clear the doorframe, stepping into the cabin's warmth with the same quiet confidence she'd shown outside. Her eyes took in everything: the sparse furnishings, the swept floor, the neat stack of firewood by the hearth. Noel saw his home through her gaze and felt a sudden sharp awareness of its limitations. The driver appeared in the doorway, stamping snow from his boots. Trunk's settled, Miss Quinn. You sure you want to stay? He cast a dubious look at Noel, who bristled at the implied criticism. I'm sure, Mr. Jenkins. Thank you for your concern. Maggie's tone was kind but firm. She pressed a coin into the driver's hand. God be with you on your journey back. And with you, Miss Quinn. The driver touched his hat brim, gave Noel one last measuring look, and departed. The sound of his wagon faded quickly, muffled by the falling snow. Silence filled the cabin. Noel stood by the door, still holding her letter, while Maggie calmly removed her snow-dusted cloak and bonnet. Without them, she seemed even taller, her simple, dark dress neat and well-made, her red hair coiled in a practical braid. I can cook, she said suddenly, as if continuing a conversation they'd been having all along. And farm. I'm strong enough for any work that needs doing. She met his gaze steadily. I know what you're thinking, Mr. Boone. That I'm too tall, too strange-looking. Not what you expected. I've heard it. All before. But I'm here because God led me here, and I don't believe he makes mistakes. Noel found his voice at last. Miss Quinn, Magnolia. Maggie, she corrected. We might as well be comfortable with each other's names. Maggie, then. Noel ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. That letter. I wrote it months ago. I wasn't in my right mind. I'd been drinking, and you were lonely, she finished softly. Lonely enough to reach out to a stranger to risk being rejected or deceived. I understand loneliness, Mr. Boone. It's what brought me here, too. She moved to the fireplace, warming her hands at the flames. We can stand here making excuses all day, or we can accept that God has his own ways of bringing people together. Noel watched her, this impossible woman who had appeared on his doorstep like an answer to a prayer he hadn't meant to make. She should have looked awkward, too large for the small cabin, but somehow she fit, as if the space had been waiting for her presence to make it complete. The letter crinkled in his hand. He looked down at it, at the words he'd written in a moment of weakness. Seeking a woman of strong character and faith, willing to share a life in the mountains. Must be hardy enough for frontier life. Age and appearance not important. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, carrying the first heavy flakes of the approaching storm. Noel thought of the long winter ahead, of the solitude that had once been a comfort, but lately felt more like a burden. He thought of the way Maggie had stepped down from that wagon, certain of her path even when it led to a stranger's door. The cabin's not much, he said finally. But it's warm, and there's plenty of food stored for winter, if you're sure about staying. I am. Maggie turned from the fire, and this time her smile reached her eyes. Shall I make us some coffee, Mr. Boone? Then perhaps we can talk properly about what happens next. Something tight in Noel's chest began to loosen, like ice breaking up in spring. "Coffee would be fine," he said, "and you'd better call me Noel." Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing the wagon tracks that had brought Maggie to his door. Inside, she moved about his kitchen with surprising grace, her presence already beginning to transform the cabin from a mere shelter into something that felt, against all odds, like it might one day be a home. Noel moved through his cabin with quick, jerky movements, gathering scattered items and shoving them into corners. The place had never felt small before, but with Maggie's presence, its limitations became glaring. He snatched up dirty shirts and worn socks, stuffing them behind a wooden chest while she stood quietly by the door. "Don't trouble yourself on my account," Maggie said, her voice gentle. "I've grown up on a farm. I know how a working man's home looks," but Noel continued his frantic tidying, all too aware of the bachelor smell that permeated the space, a mixture of wood smoke, unwashed clothes, and last week's stew. He opened the cabin's single window, letting in a blast of cold air that stirred the stale atmosphere. "Might want to close that soon," Maggie observed, finally removing her snow-dusted cloak. "Storm's coming in fast." As she hung the heavy garment on a peg by the door, her true height became apparent. Noel stopped his cleaning, struck by the sight. Maggie's head nearly brushed the cabin's rough-hewn rafters, forcing her to duck slightly as she moved. Her practical dark dress couldn't hide her strong, capable frame. Here was a woman built for frontier life, whether she meant to be or not. "Had to mind my head on the train," she said matter-of-factly, catching his stare. "Conductors thought it right amusing, but the good Lord made me as I am." No use fretting over it. Noel closed the window, grateful for something to do with his hands. "The train? You came by rail?" "Most of the way." Maggie settled herself on a sturdy wooden chair which creaked but held firm. 3 weeks from Boston to Denver. Changed trains twice. Then Mr. Jenkins and his wagon brought me up through the passes." She smiled slightly. "Had some folk try to talk me out of it. Said no one in their right mind would come up here with winter coming on." The shame of his drunken decision burned fresh in Noel's gut. He busied himself at the cook stove, adding wood to build up the heat. "They weren't wrong," he muttered. "Winters here are harsh. Lonely too." "Lonely is nothing new to me, Mr. Boone." "Noel," she corrected herself. "But I've found that loneliness shared is easier to bear than loneliness suffered alone." He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he reached for the bean pot hanging near the fire and a pan of yesterday's cornbread. "It's not much," he said gruffly. "Wasn't expecting company." "It's food, and I'm grateful for it." Maggie watched as he set out 2 tin plates and cups, her eyes taking in every detail of his movements. "Would you mind if I said grace?" Noel paused in the act of spooning out beans. It had been years since he'd heard a proper blessing said over food. If you want to." Maggie bowed her head, her voice clear and strong in the cabin's dimness. "Dear Lord, we thank you for this food and shelter, for safe passage through storm and trial, and for bringing 2 lonely souls together under one roof. Guide our hearts in your wisdom, and help us see the path you've laid before us. Amen." "Amen," Noel echoed automatically, the word feeling strange on his tongue. He served the food quickly, avoiding her eyes. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the wind's rising moan outside. Finally, Maggie set down her cup and folded her hands in her lap. "I should tell you something," she said. "The contract brought me here, yes, but it's not what kept me coming when the way got hard." She waited until he looked up. "I prayed about this decision, Noel. Prayed hard and long. And I felt in my heart that God was sending me to someone in need, someone who needed not just a wife, but a partner in faith and purpose." Noel shifted uncomfortably on his chair. The idea that God would take any interest in his life seemed far-fetched after all he'd done, all the violence and waste of his younger years. "You're putting a mighty lot of trust in a prayer," he said roughly. "I'm putting my trust in the Lord," she corrected. "The same Lord who made me too tall for most men's liking, but strong enough to work any farm or ranch. The same Lord who led me to that church agency the very day your letter arrived." Her smile held no bitterness, only a serene acceptance. "I've learned not to question his methods." The wind rattled the window panes, and a log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. Noel watched them fade, thinking of all the nights he'd sat alone in this cabin, nursing his regrets with whiskey and silence. Now here sat this woman, calm and certain, speaking of divine purpose as easily as discussing the weather. "You'll take the bed," he said abruptly, standing to clear the plates. "I'll sleep in the chair." "That's kind of you." Maggie rose to help with the washing up, her movements efficient despite the need to stoop slightly. "Though I hope you'll let me make some changes tomorrow." This cabin could use a woman's touch. Noel grunted non-committally, but he found himself wondering what changes she had in mind. The cabin had served his basic needs, but looking at it through her eyes, he saw its potential for the first time. The empty corners that could hold shelves, the bare walls that might welcome curtains or pictures. As night settled in fully, Noel banked the fire while Maggie prepared for bed. He'd given her what privacy he could, rigging up an old blanket as a makeshift screen around the bed. Now he sat in his chair, listening to the soft sounds of her moving about, the rustle of fabric as she changed into her nightclothes. The lamp's low flame cast her silhouette against the blanket, a tall, graceful shadow that seemed both foreign and oddly right in his home. He watched as she knelt beside the bed, her head bowed in prayer once more. Her whispered words were too quiet to make out, but their cadence was somehow comforting, like the murmur of a distant stream. "Good night, Noel," she said finally, her shadow straightening and slipping beneath the covers. "Night," he replied, shifting to find a comfortable position in the chair. Outside, the storm had settled into a steady rhythm of wind and snow, but inside, the cabin felt different, warmer somehow, as if Maggie's presence had changed more than just the physical space. Noel stayed awake long after her breathing had settled into the deep pattern of sleep. He studied the contract that still lay on the table, his drunken signature stark against the paper. What had seemed like a foolish mistake now felt like something else entirely, something he couldn't quite name, but that stirred an unfamiliar hope in his chest. The lamp flickered low, casting strange shadows on the walls. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in the quiet hours between night and morning, Noel allowed himself to wonder if perhaps Maggie was right, if God did indeed work in mysterious ways, bringing healing to broken places through unexpected means. He pulled his coat tighter against the night's chill, listening to the soft sound of Maggie's breathing mixing with the storm's whispered song. Whatever came next, he realized, she would face it with that same quiet strength she'd shown today. She hadn't come here as a last resort or out of desperation, but with purpose and faith. Faith in God's plan, and perhaps, though he couldn't fathom why, faith in him. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Noel closed his eyes, but sleep was long in coming, his mind full of tall shadows and steady voices speaking of providence in the wilderness of his solitary life. Dawn painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of rose and gold when Noel woke to unfamiliar sounds in his cabin. The crackle of a freshly stoked fire mingled with the soft clinking of his iron skillet and the whisper of a woman's humming. For a moment, he lay still in his chair, muscles stiff from the awkward night's rest, trying to remember why these domestic sounds filled his usually quiet home. Then he caught the scent of frying venison and remembered Maggie Quinn, his mail-order bride, had arrived yesterday. He opened his eyes to find her already dressed and working at the cook stove, her tall frame moving with practiced ease despite having to stoop slightly beneath the low-hanging pots. She'd tied an apron over her plain brown dress and pulled her dark hair back with a ribbon. "Good morning," she said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind?" But I found some oats in your stores and that venison needed using before it spoiled. Noel sat up, running a hand through his beard. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. She stirred something in a pot that smelled of cinnamon. Seems to me a marriage should start with a proper breakfast, even if the papers aren't signed yet. The mention of marriage made his stomach twist. He stood, stretching out the kinks in his back, and moved to splash cold water on his face from the wash basin. I've put coffee on too, Maggie added, though I reckon you might want it stronger than I make it. Before Noel could respond, she'd already begun tidying, gathering scattered items into neat piles, straightening the few pieces of furniture, and eyeing the dusty corners with clear intent. Now hold on, he protested as she reached for his broom. You don't need to be cleaning up after me. Maggie smiled, already sweeping. It's not just your home anymore, is it? Besides, she added, using her height to advantage as she knocked down a cobweb. I've always believed cleanliness is next to godliness, as my mother used to say. Noel watched helplessly as she transformed his bachelor clutter into something resembling order. She handled his few possessions with respect, but moved them with firm purpose. Gun cleaning supplies to a shelf by the door, trapping equipment to hooks on the wall, old newspapers stacked. For kindling, the breakfast she set before him was better than anything he'd eaten in months. Hot oats sweetened with the last of his honey, venison fried crisp but not tough, and coffee that, truth be told, was perfectly brewed. We'll need supplies, Maggie said as they ate. I saw how low your flour bin is and you're almost out of lamp oil. Noel nodded reluctantly. Town's about 4 miles down in the valley. I've got a mule we can hitch to the sled, seeing as there's snow. That would be fine. She cleared their plates with efficient movements. I've got a bit of money saved if needed. No, he said quickly. I can provide. The trip to town took longer than usual. The mule picked its way carefully through the fresh snow, while Maggie sat beside Noel on the sled's narrow seat. She seemed unbothered by the cold, though he noticed she kept her hands tucked into her cloak. The small trading town of Pine Creek sprawled along the valley floor, a collection of wooden buildings and rutted streets. As they approached, Noel felt Maggie tense beside him, though her expression remained serene. The whispers started as soon as they tied up at the general store's hitching post. Noel heard them clearly, the shocked mutters about Maggie's height, the cruel snickers, the speculation about why such a woman would come to their remote town. Inside the store, Maggie moved with quiet dignity, selecting flour, nails, lamp oil, and a few other necessities. The shopkeeper's wife stared openly, while several customers found excuses to walk past and gawk. Lord above, she's tall as a pine tree, one woman whispered too loudly to her friend. Noel kept his head down, shame burning in his gut as he heard more whispers. He should say something, should defend her, but the words stuck in his throat. Years of avoiding confrontation, of keeping to himself, had left him ill-equipped for this situation. The worst came outside the store as they loaded their purchases. A group of men loitered nearby, and one, Ted Wilson, a ranch hand known for his mean streak, called out with a smirk, "Hey Boone, didn't know Goliath had a widow. You must be desperate to take on such a handful." Laughter rippled through the group. Noel's hands clenched on the flour sack he was lifting, but before he could respond, or more likely retreat, Maggie's voice rang out, clear and strong. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, she said, turning to face the men. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. She stepped forward, her height allowing her to look down at Wilson. I wonder, sir, what he sees in yours. The laughter died. Wilson's face reddened, but he found no clever response. Some of the onlookers had the grace to look ashamed, though others continued to snicker behind their hands. Maggie turned back to the sled, taking the flour sack from Noel's frozen grip and setting it in place with easy strength. I believe we have everything we need, she said calmly, as if nothing had happened. Noel climbed up beside her, acutely aware of his cowardice. He should have been the one to speak up, to defend her honor. Instead, she'd shown more courage and dignity than he could muster. The return journey started in silence. The mule's hooves squeaked against the snow, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called. Maggie sat straight-backed beside him, her profile etched against the winter sky. "I'm sorry," Noel finally managed, the words feeling inadequate. "About the townfolk. About not speaking up." "Don't be sorry," she replied, her voice gentle. "Be better next time." She turned to look at him, and there was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. Those who mock what's different do so from their own fear and smallness. I learned long ago not to let their words diminish me. Noel watched the way she held herself, tall and unashamed despite the morning's humiliation. He thought of how easily she'd quoted scripture, using it not as a weapon, but as a shield, a source of strength. The sun climbed higher as they made their way back up the mountain, making the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Maggie began humming again, the same quiet tune from morning, and Noel found himself listening, letting the gentle sound wash away some of his shame. He realized that in just one day, this remarkable woman had begun changing not just his cabin, but something deeper. Something in the lonely spaces of his heart that he'd thought long since closed to change. The thought was both comforting and terrifying, like standing at the edge of an unexplored valley, knowing you must eventually step forward into the unknown. The mule plodded onward through the snow, carrying them and their supplies back to the cabin that was no longer just his, but theirs. Behind them, the town grew smaller, its whispers fading into the winter silence of the high country. The winter sun hung low on the horizon as Noel guided the mule-drawn sled back to the cabin. Long shadows stretched across the snow, and the temperature had dropped enough to make their breath visible in the crisp mountain air. Maggie sat beside him, still humming that quiet tune, though her cheeks were pink from the cold. Once they arrived, they worked together to unload their supplies. Maggie's strength matched his own as they carried sacks of flour and other provisions inside. The cabin welcomed them with leftover warmth from the morning's fire, which Noel quickly built back up with fresh logs. "I'll fix us some supper," Maggie said, already moving to the kitchen area. "Something warm to chase away the chill." Noel watched as she worked, her movements sure and practiced. She combined cornmeal, the last of his dried beans, and some preserved venison into a hearty stew that soon filled the cabin with savory aromas. The familiar sounds of cooking, the bubble of the pot, the scrape of the wooden spoon, seemed somehow different with her there, less lonely, perhaps. As they sat down to eat, the last rays of sunlight painted the cabin's interior in soft golden hues. Maggie bowed, her head to say grace, and Noel found himself lowering his head too, though prayer hadn't been his habit for years. "Miss Quinn," he began, then corrected himself. "Maggie, I need to say something." She looked up from her bowl, waiting patiently. He cleared his throat, struggling with the words. "Truth is, I never expected you to actually come. That letter I sent, I barely remember writing it, was deep in my cups that night." "I figured as much," she replied, her voice gentle. The handwriting was rather unsteady. "And after today, seeing how folks treated you..." He stirred his stew, shame coloring his words. "No one should have to endure such scorn, least of all on my account." Maggie set down her spoon, her expression serious but kind. "Mr. Boone, Noel, do you think this is the first time I've faced such treatment? Back east on the farms where I worked, there wasn't a day that passed without someone making sport of my height." She straightened in her chair, her head nearly brushing the ceiling. "The Lord made me as I am, and I've learned to bear it. Their words can't diminish me unless I let them." Her eyes met his, steady and clear. "But I hope you won't always run from your own battles. A person can't live their whole life hiding from conflict, whether it comes from town gossips or..." She paused as the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening quiet. Noel rose quickly, moving to the window. 3 riders approached through the gathering dusk, their horses' hooves crunching in the snow. The men wore heavy coats and carried rifles slung across their saddles. Not unusual for travelers in these parts, but something about their purposeful approach set Noel's instincts on edge. "Evening, Boone," the lead rider called out as they reined up in front of the cabin. "Mind if we warm ourselves a spell?" Noel recognized him, Jeb Tanner, foreman for the railroad survey crew that had been mapping the valley below. The other 2 men were strangers, probably hired guns by the look of them. "Come in, then," Noel said reluctantly, knowing refusal would only breed trouble. "Mind your manners. I have company." The men stomped snow from their boots before entering. Tanner's eyebrows rose at the sight of Maggie, but he kept whatever remarks he might have made to himself. His companions weren't so polite, exchanging meaningful glances and poorly hidden smirks. "Coffee's hot," Maggie said, already reaching for extra cups. Her composed manner seemed to unsettle the men slightly, as if they'd expected something different. "Much obliged, ma'am," Tanner said, removing his hat. "Though this isn't purely a social call, I'm afraid." He accepted the coffee but remained standing, using his height to advantage. "We're here about the spring, Boone." Noel felt his muscles tense. The mountain spring that fed his creek was the lifeblood of his small homestead, providing clean water year-round even in the deepest winter. "What about it?" he asked, keeping his voice level. "Railroads claiming water rights to all springs above the new track line," Tanner said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "Your spring's been surveyed as a necessary water stop for the steam engines. Companies prepared to offer fair compensation for you to vacate the property before winter's end." "This is my land," Noel said quietly, "deeded and registered proper. The spring's been part of this homestead for 15 years. Tanner shrugged, a practiced gesture of false sympathy. "Progress doesn't wait for hermits or giants, Boone. Railroad's coming whether folks like it or not. Better to take the offer now, while it's friendly-like." One of his companions shifted his coat, deliberately revealing the revolver at his hip. "Lot of accidents can happen in these mountains," he added, "especially to folks who don't see which way the wind's blowing." Maggie stood then, drawing herself up to her full height. The motion caught everyone's attention, and even Tanner had to tilt his head back to meet her gaze. "I believe," she said calmly, "that you've said your piece, gentlemen. The hour's late, and the trail down can be treacherous after dark." There was steel in her voice, though her words remained courteous. The 2 hired guns glanced at each other, clearly unsettled by this woman who towered over them with such quiet authority. Tanner's face hardened, but he maintained his smooth manner. "Just think it over, Boone. We'll be back once the snow settles." He set his barely touched coffee on the table. "Much obliged for the hospitality, ma'am." The men filed out, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Soon the sound of horses moving, off into the darkness, filled the cabin, then faded into distance. Silence stretched between Noel and Maggie. He stood at the window, watching until the riders disappeared down the trail, his hands clenched at his sides. The railroad had been pushing up through the valley for months, but he'd never thought they'd come for his spring. He felt Maggie's presence before her hand came to rest gently on his arm. Her touch was warm, steady, grounding him in the moment. "This trouble won't go away on its own," she said softly. "No," he agreed, still staring out into the darkness. "I reckon it won't." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Their half-eaten supper sat forgotten on the table, the stew growing cold in its bowls. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, its lonely cry echoing off the mountainsides. Maggie's hand remained on his arm, and in that simple touch, Noel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The knowledge that he wasn't facing this threat alone. The realization both comforted and unsettled him, like the first warm wind of spring that promises change but carries no guarantees. The railroad men's threats hung in the air between them, as tangible as the wood smoke from the fire. Both Noel and Maggie knew this was only the beginning. that Tanner and his men would return, bringing with them the full weight of the railroad's ambitions. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a log shifting in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Maggie moved to tend to it, her practical nature asserting itself even in the face of trouble. Noel watched her, wondering how this woman he'd known for barely a day had already become such a steady presence in his life. The night pressed against the cabin windows, dark and full of uncertainty. But inside, the fire burned warm, and two people who had been strangers that morning found themselves united against a common threat, their futures now intertwined in ways neither could have predicted. The days following the railroad men's visit brought heavy snow to the mountains. Thick flakes fell steadily, turning the world outside the cabin into a pristine white blanket. Inside, life settled into an unexpected rhythm between the reluctant mountain man and his towering mail-order bride. Noel woke early one morning to the rhythmic sound of wood splitting. He pulled on his boots and coat, stepping out onto the cabin's small porch. There stood Maggie, her breath visible in the cold air, wielding his axe with practiced ease. Her powerful arms swung the tool in perfect arcs, each stroke precise and purposeful. A neat pile of split logs already stood testament to her morning's work. She paused, wiping her brow with her sleeve, and noticed him watching. "Good morning," she called out cheerfully. "Thought I'd get an early start." The north wind's picking up something fierce. Noel nodded, studying the woodpile. Her cuts were clean and even, the work of someone who clearly knew their way around an axe. "Reckon you've done this before," he said. "Since I was tall enough to swing one," she replied, setting another log on the cutting block. "Back home in Ireland, then on the farms out east. Wood needs splitting wherever you go." The axe fell, and the log split perfectly down its center. Throughout the morning, Noel found his eyes drawn to Maggie as she moved about the homestead with quiet efficiency. She hauled water from the creek without complaint, her long stride making easy work of the distance. When she noticed a leak in the cabin's roof, she climbed up with his tools and some spare shingles, her height allowing her to reach places that would have required a ladder for most. The leak fixed, she came down and brushed snow from her skirts as if repairing roofs was just another daily chore. "That should hold now," she said, returning his hammer. "Though we might want to check the whole roof come spring." Her casual use of "we" caught his attention. There was no pretense in it, just a simple assumption of shared responsibility that made him unexpectedly warm, despite the winter chill. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the mountains, promising more snow. Noel sat at the cabin's small table, methodically cleaning and sharpening his rifle. The familiar task usually brought him comfort, but today his movements were tense, mechanical. Maggie watched him from where she was kneading dough for bread. "Do you always prepare for trouble, Mr. Boone?" she asked quietly. Noel's hands stilled on the rifle. He stared at the weapon, its metal gleaming in the gray light from the window. "Used to be trouble was all I knew," he admitted, his voice low. "Years back seems like every town I rode into, violence followed. Saloon fights, border disputes, range wars." He trailed off, lost in memories he'd rather forget. "That's why you came up here?" Maggie's questions were gentle, free of judgment. "Figured if I stayed far enough away from folks, I couldn't hurt anyone else." "Couldn't get hurt, neither." He ran the cleaning cloth along the rifle's barrel, the motion almost unconscious. "But now, with the railroad coming—" "You're afraid of returning to that life," Maggie finished for him. She wiped flour from her hands and moved to sit across from him at the table. "The past doesn't have to define your future, Noel." He looked up, meeting her steady gaze. "Don't it? Some stains don't wash clean, no matter how hard you scrub." "The Lord specializes in impossible cleaning," she said with a small smile. "I believe he brought me here not to fight, but to heal. Perhaps not just you, but this whole situation." "Heal? How do you reckon to heal something like this?" Noel gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the valley where the railroad men waited. "With patience. With faith." She reached across the table and gently touched his hand, the one gripping the rifle. "With the courage to believe that peace is stronger then violence. Noel didn't pull away from her touch. Her hand was warm, calloused from honest work, steady as a mountain peak. They sat in silence for a long moment, while outside the wind whispered through pine boughs heavy with snow. The quiet between them felt different from the lonely silence he'd known before. It held something new, understanding, perhaps, or hope. Fragile as early spring ice, but just as real. As evening approached, Maggie returned to her bread-making while Noel finished with his rifle. The familiar sense of yeast and wood smoke filled the cabin, making it feel more like a home than it had in years. But as he watched Maggie work, his mind wandered back to their trip to town, to the cruel laughter and mocking words thrown at her. Shame burned in his chest again, sharper now than before. He'd stood silent while they'd ridiculed her, and let fear of confrontation keep him mute. The memory of his cowardice sat like a stone in his stomach. Maggie must have sensed his darkening mood. "What troubles you?" she asked, shaping the dough into loaves. "Been thinking about town. About how those folks treated you." He set the rifle aside, unable to meet her eyes. "A man ought to stand up for his—" He hesitated, uncertain how to define what she was to him. "For those in his care," he finished awkwardly. "You're not responsible for other people's cruelty, Noel." "No, but I'm responsible for my own silence in the face of it." He stood, moving to stare out the window at the falling snow. "I aim to do better. Just don't rightly know how yet." Maggie's reflection appeared beside his in the glass, her height making her presence impossible too. "Ignore. Sometimes," she said softly, "doing better starts with simply deciding to do so. The how of it comes with time and prayer." The snow continued to fall outside, adding another layer to the deep white blanket covering the mountain. Inside, the bread dough rose slowly by the fire, filling the cabin with its homey smell. Noel watched their reflections in the window glass, the tall, strong woman and the man who had hidden from the world for so long. He'd spent years believing isolation was his only path to peace. Now, with Maggie's arrival, everything he'd assumed about his life was shifting, like spring thaw breaking up river ice. It was uncomfortable, unsettling, and yet somehow necessary. The last light of day faded from the sky, and Maggie lit the oil lamp, its warm glow pushing back the gathering darkness. She hummed softly as she worked, an old hymn that spoke of grace and redemption. Noel found himself listening, letting the quiet melody wash over him like gentle rain on parched earth. His silent resolution to do better took root in his heart, though the path forward remained unclear. But for the first time in years, he felt something like hope stirring in his soul. Hope brought by this remarkable woman who split wood like a lumberjack and spoke truth with the gentleness of falling snow. The evening settled around them, peaceful despite the uncertainties that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they shared the warmth of the fire, the promise of fresh bread, and the quiet understanding that neither of them faced the future alone. 2 days of clear skies melted enough snow from the mountain paths for safe travel. Noel hitched his mule to the wagon, while Maggie secured empty barrels and crates for supplies. The morning sun glinted off remaining patches of white, making the world sparkle like scattered diamonds. "Reckon we need flour, sugar, and coffee," Noel said, checking the wagon's wheels. "Maybe some salt pork if the price ain't too dear." Maggie nodded, adjusting her shawl against the crisp air. "And thread. The cabin curtains need mending something fierce." She climbed up to the wagon seat with surprising grace despite her height, settling the folds of her dress around her. The ride down to town took longer than usual, the wagon wheels sometimes catching in muddy patches where snow had melted. Maggie didn't seem to mind the slow pace, pointing out deer tracks and early spring birds. Her quiet appreciation of the land's beauty made Noel see his familiar route with fresh eyes. As they approached the town, Noel felt the familiar tension creep into his shoulders. But Maggie sat straight and calm beside him, her presence somehow steadying. The main street was busy with morning traffic. farmers in for supplies, women carrying baskets of eggs and butter to trade, children racing between buildings in games of tag. They pulled up in front of the general store, and Noel helped Maggie down from the wagon. A group of children stopped their play to stare at her, wide-eyed at her impressive height. Instead of hurrying past as she had on their last visit, Maggie smiled warmly at them. "Good morning, little ones," she said, crouching down to meet their eyes despite her skirts trailing in the muddy street. "My, what a fine game you're having." A small girl with braided pigtails stepped forward, curiosity overcoming shyness. "How'd you get so tall, ma'am?" "The good Lord just kept on growing me," Maggie answered with a gentle laugh. "Means I can reach all sorts of things others can't, like that bird's nest up there." She pointed to a mud-daubed nest tucked under the store's eaves. The children gathered closer, their initial awe turning to interest. "Can you touch the clouds?" a freckled boy asked earnestly. "Not quite," Maggie said, "though sometimes the morning mist up on the mountain makes me feel like I could." Noel watched from the wagon, something warm and unfamiliar stirring in his chest at the sight of Maggie with the children. Her gentleness with them seemed to soften the stares of passing townsfolk, though whispers still followed in her wake. "A blessed morning to you both," a deep voice called out. Noel turned to see a man in a well-worn black coat approaching, his silver hair and kind eyes marking him as someone of respect despite his humble dress. "Reverend Josiah Cole," the man introduced himself, extending his hand first to Maggie then to Noel. "I've been hoping to meet our new arrival properly." Noel tensed, expecting judgment, but the preacher's welcome seemed genuine. Maggie rose smoothly from her crouch, yet the Reverend showed no reaction to her height except a warm smile. "Magnolia Quinn, Reverend," she said, clasping his offered hand, "though most call me Maggie. Welcome to our little flock, Sister Maggie." The Reverend turned to Noel. "And, Brother Boone, it's good to see you down from the mountain. We've missed you at services these past years." Noel shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct kindness. "Been keeping to myself, Reverend." "The Lord works in his own time," Cole said simply. "Know that you're both welcome whenever you wish to join us." He tipped his hat and moved on, pausing to ruffle the hair of the children who had returned to their play. Inside the general store, Noel gathered their needed supplies while Maggie examined spools of thread. The store owner's wife, usually pinch-faced and suspicious, thawed slightly when Maggie complimented her fabric selection and shared a tip about keeping moss from woolens. As Noel waited for their purchases to be totaled, he overheard two farmers talking in low voices near the seed bins. "Offered half what the land's worth, but Jensen had to sell," Bank was calling in his note. "Railroad's been buying up everything they can, heard they sent men to pressure old Williams last week. Ain't just land they're after. Water rights, too. Can't run them steam engines without good water sources." Noel's hands stilled on the counter. Maggie appeared at his elbow, her expression thoughtful. "The spring," she said quietly as they loaded the wagon. "That's what those men really want. Your land controls the watershed for this whole valley." Noel secured the last barrel of flour. "Reckon you're right. Pure mountain spring water, flowing year-round. Worth more than gold to a railroad." They started the journey home, the wagon considerably heavier with supplies. The sun had risen high, making the remaining snow glitter. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and wet earth, hinting at the coming spring. Maggie began to hum softly, an old tune that seemed to rise and fall like flowing water. The simple melody filled the space between them, somehow making the quiet more comfortable rather than less. "What's that song?" Noel asked, after a while, surprising himself with the question. "An old hymn my grandmother taught me," Maggie replied. "About finding peace in troubled times." She sang a few words in what must have been Gaelic, the ancient language lending gravity to the tune. Noel listened, letting the gentle music wash over him. The knot of tension he usually carried between his shoulders began to loosen, replaced by something lighter. It wasn't quite peace. He'd forgotten what the felt like years ago. but it was closer than he'd come in a long time. They passed the spot where the valley narrowed, where his spring-fed creek joined the larger stream. Maggie's humming faded as she studied the terrain with knowing eyes. "Water's always been precious," she said. "Back home in Ireland, they say every well has its spirit, every spring its story." She turned to look at him. "What's the story of your spring, Noel?" He considered the question, watching the play of sunlight on the creek's surface. "Found it 7 years back when I was running from everything. Seemed like the land itself was offering shelter. Clean water, good atemming. Quiet, place to heal." He paused. "Never thought I'd have to defend it." "Sometimes the things worth keeping require defending," Maggie said softly, "though not always in the ways we expect." They continued up the mountain track, the wagon wheels creaking a counterpoint to the rushing water beside them. Maggie resumed her humming, the old hymn blending with the natural sounds around them. Noel found himself breathing easier, as if the music itself was teaching him how to let go of ancient hurts one note at a time. Near the cabin, a pair of bluebirds darted across their path, flashing bright against the dark pines. Maggie's song trailed off as she watched them, a smile touching her lips. "First bluebirds I've seen this season," she said. "Back east. They say that's a sign of hope." Noel helped her down from the wagon, noticing how the afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her hair. "Seems like you bring signs of hope wherever you go," he said quietly, then looked away, surprised by his own words. But Maggie just squeezed his hand briefly before turning to unload their supplies. The touch was gentle, unremarkable, really. Yet Noel felt its warmth long after they'd carried everything inside. He found himself remembering the children's faces. As they gathered around her, the Reverend's genuine welcome, the way even the store owner's suspicious wife had softened. Perhaps, he thought as he watched Maggie organize their purchases, hope wasn't something that arrived all at once like a lightning strike. Maybe it came gradually like spring thaw or morning light, or an Irish hymn sung on a mountain trail. Maybe it came in the shape of a tall woman who faced mockery with grace and met hardship with steady faith. The afternoon settled around them as they worked together, storing supplies and preparing the evening meal. Outside their window, the creek gurgled its endless song, the water that had drawn him here 7 years ago still flowing clean and bright. Maggie was right. It was worth defending. He just had to figure out how to do it without returning to the violence of his past. For now, though, he let himself rest in the simple peace of the moment, the smell of coffee brewing, the sound of Maggie humming as she mended curtains, the last rays of sun painting the cabin walls gold. Small blessings, perhaps, but real ones nonetheless. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow as Noel and Maggie returned to the cabin. Through the crystalline mountain air, they heard it first, the sound of trudging feet and a child's whimper. Rounding the bend, they spotted a woman and 3 children struggling through the deep snow, their clothes thin against the bitter cold. "Lord have mercy," Maggie whispered, already climbing down from the wagon. The woman stumbled, catching herself against a pine trunk. Her children huddled close, the oldest no more than 10 years, the youngest barely walking. "Ma'am," Maggie called out, moving forward with careful steps. "You're a fair piece from town in this weather." The woman raised her head, revealing hollow cheeks and eyes bright with desperation. "Our farm's 5 miles on," she said, voice cracking. "Lost our horse to colic last week. Been walking since dawn." "I'm Magnolia Quinn," Maggie said gently. "This here's Noel Boone. His cabin's just ahead." Noel hung back, uncertain. Years of solitude had made him wary of strangers, but something in the children's pinched faces stirred memories of his own hungry youth. "Sarah Albright," the woman managed. "My husband." She swallowed hard. "Fever took him last fall." "You'll come warm yourselves," Maggie declared, Not a question, but a certainty. She looked to Noel, her eyes both gentle and firm. He shifted, then nodded. Got plenty of firewood. The smallest child, a girl with corn silk hair, began to cry. Without hesitation, Maggie scooped her up, humming softly. The child's tears slowed as she stared up at Maggie's height in wonder. Like being lifted by an angel, the middle boy whispered, earning a tired smile from his mother. They made their way to the cabin, Maggie carrying the little one while helping Sarah along. Noel led the mule and wagon, the oldest boy trudging beside him in determined silence. Inside, Maggie set to work with quiet efficiency. She stoked the fire, wrapped the family in warm blankets, and began preparing a hearty stew with their fresh supplies, the cabin filled with the rich smell of cooking meat and vegetables. "When did you eat last?" she asked Sarah, who sat slumped in Noel's chair, her younger children pressed against her sides. "Yesterday morning," Sarah admitted. "Had to make the food stretch." Maggie's hands never stopped moving as she worked. "Well, there's plenty here now. The good Lord provides, often through unexpected means." The children watched Maggie with a mixture of awe and lingering fear, shrinking back when she moved near. Noel understood their reaction. He'd seen it countless times when people first encountered her remarkable height. But then Maggie did something unexpected. She knelt down to their level, making herself less imposing. "Would you like to touch the ceiling?" she asked with a conspiratorial smile. "Not many get the chance, but I reckon I could help." The middle boy's eyes widened. "Really?" "Indeed." Maggie stood, reaching her full height. "Who wants to go first?" The little girl pushed forward, previous tears forgotten. With gentle hands, Maggie lifted her high. The child squealed with delight as her fingers brushed the rough-hewn rafters. "Me next," the middle boy called, previous shyness forgotten. Soon the cabin rang with laughter as Maggie lifted each child in turn. Even the oldest boy couldn't resist a try, though he tried to maintain his dignity. Sarah watched with tears in her eyes, joy and gratitude mingling on her tired face. Noel stood in the corner, overwhelmed by the transformation. His cabin had been silent for so long, the only sounds his own breathing and the crack of the fire. Now it echoed with children's laughter, with Maggie's warm voice, with the bubble of stew and the scrape of spoons as they all ate together. "Best meal I've had in months," Sarah said softly, watching her children eat their fill. "We're much obliged to you both." "There's plenty more," Maggie assured her. "And you'll sleep warm tonight." After supper, Maggie arranged comfortable bedding near the fire for Sarah and her children. Noel contributed his own blankets without being asked, surprising himself. The family fell asleep quickly, exhaustion finally claiming them. Maggie and Noel sat at the table, speaking in low voices by lamplight. "We'll send them with provisions tomorrow," Maggie said. "Flour, beans, some of that salt pork." Noel nodded. "Got some extra blankets in the storage shed, too." Maggie smiled at him, approval warming her eyes. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sleeping family. The cabin felt different somehow, fuller, warmer, more alive. "Amazing how a house changes when shared," Maggie mused, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like it remembers what it was built for in the first place." Noel considered her words, feeling both uneasy and touched. He'd chosen isolation deliberately, believing solitude was safer than the complications of human connection. Yet watching Sarah's children sleep peacefully, their faces smooth and trusting, stirred something long dormant in his heart. Later, after banking the fire for the night, Maggie settled in her chair while Noel took his usual place near the door. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, peaceful rather than empty. "Why did you stop attending church?" Maggie asked suddenly, her voice gentle in the darkness. Noel stiffened, then slowly relaxed. Something about the night's events had softened his usual defenses. After the war, after everything, seemed like I'd seen too much blood for any kind of faith to make sense. He expected judgment or argument, but Maggie simply listened, her silence encouraging rather than demanding. "Used to believe in good and evil clear as black and white," he continued. "Then I saw good men do terrible things. Saw myself do things." He trailed off, old shame tightening his throat. "Faith isn't about being perfect," Maggie said after a while. "It's about knowing we need something bigger than ourselves to make sense of it all." Noel stayed silent, but she must have sensed him listening because she went on. "You know how a fire can look dead, nothing but ash on top?" She gestured toward their banked fireplace. "But underneath, there are still embers glowing, just waiting for someone to stir them up, add fresh kindling." She looked at him steadily. "Faith can be like that too." The analogy struck him deeply, though he wasn't ready to admit it. Instead, he watched the faint red glow beneath the gray ashes of their fire, thinking about how quickly it could spark back to life with proper tending. Sarah's youngest stirred in her sleep, making small sounds of distress. Before Noel could move, Maggie was already there, humming that same Irish hymn from earlier. The child settled, turning toward the sound like a flower toward sunlight. Noel watched Maggie's tall form move back to her chair, graceful despite the late hour. The cabin felt different with her in it, with the family sleeping nearby. Less like a fortress against the world and more like home. He wasn't ready to return to church, wasn't even sure he could. But watching Maggie's quiet ministry to the widow and her children, he began to understand that perhaps faith worked through people as much as prayers. Maybe it was less about what you believed and more about how you lived those beliefs. The night deepened around them, snow falling softly outside. Inside, the cabin held its sleeping occupants like precious things, each breath adding to the gentle rhythm of shared life. Noel felt something shift in his heart, like buried embers stirring under ash, waiting for the right moment to kindle back to flame. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the mountain air sharp as glass. Noel stood before his cracked mirror, fumbling with buttons on a shirt he hadn't worn in years. His fingers felt thick and clumsy, unused to such delicate work. "Here, let me help." Maggie's sure hands steadied his trembling ones. She wore her best dress, a simple brown wool that somehow made her height seem more graceful than imposing. Her red hair was neatly braided, caught up with a ribbon. "Don't reckon this is such a good idea," Noel muttered, but allowed her to straighten his collar. "The Lord welcomes all his children home," Maggie said simply. "No matter how long they've been away, Outside, frost glittered on every surface. They hitched the mule to the sled, laying fresh hay in the back for warmth. Maggie settled beside Noel on the wooden seat, her shoulder brushing his as they began their descent into town. The sun climbed higher as they drove, making the snow-covered pines sparkle. Noel kept his eyes fixed on the road, his stomach churning. Years had passed since he'd last set foot in church. The thought of facing all those people, their judgment, their whispers. "I'll be right beside you," Maggie said softly, as if reading his thoughts. The church bell was ringing as they approached town, its clear tone carrying across the valley. Other sleds and wagons converged on the simple wooden building, families bundled against the cold. Noel's hands tightened on the reins as heads turned their way. They tied the mule at the hitching post, and Noel helped Maggie down from the sled, though she hardly needed it. Together they climbed the steps, their boots leaving tracks in the fresh snow. A hush fell as they entered. The congregation turned almost as one, staring at Maggie's towering form. She had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. Noel felt his face burn, old shame rising up to choke him. But then Reverend Cole stepped forward, his weathered face creasing in a genuine smile. "Welcome, welcome," he called out, extending both hands to them. "What a joy to see you both here today." The preacher's warm greeting seemed to break the spell. A few people nodded, some even smiled. Maggie inclined her head gracefully, and Noel managed a stiff nod of his own. They found seats near the back, in a pew that creaked under their combined weight. Noel sat rigid, hyper-aware of every whisper, every sideways glance. But Maggie's presence beside him was steady as a mountain. The service began with a familiar hymn. Noel hadn't sung in years, wasn't sure he remembered how. But then Maggie's voice rose clear and strong beside him, filling the small church with its pure tone. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Her voice seemed to lift the entire congregation, encouraging others to sing louder. Even Noel found himself humming along, the words coming back from some deep place in his memory. Reverend Cole's sermon was simple but touching, speaking of God's love for all his children, no matter their size or station. Noel caught the gentle emphasis and was grateful for the preacher's tact. "For God sees, not as man sees," Cole said, his eyes sweeping the congregation. "Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Noel glanced at Maggie and saw tears glinting in her eyes, though her face remained serene. He realized she'd quoted those same words in town when people had mocked her. The verse meant something special to her. After the service, several children gathered around Maggie, their initial shyness overcome by curiosity. Instead of standing tall and intimidating, she knelt down to their level, her skirts pooling around her. "You're as tall as a tree," one little boy exclaimed. Maggie laughed, a warm sound that seemed to fill the church. "The good Lord made me this way for his purposes," she said, "just as he made each of you special too." The children crowded closer as she spoke with each one, asking their names, complimenting a new dress or a carefully combed head of hair. When one small girl asked for a blessing, Maggie's face softened with tender joy. "May the Lord bless you and keep you," she said, her hand gentle on the child's head. "May his face shine upon you and give you peace." Soon other children were asking for blessings too. Maggie gave each one individual attention, speaking words of grace and encouragement. Parents watched from nearby, their expressions slowly changing from uncertainty to appreciation. Noel observed it all, his heart full of conflicting emotions. Pride in Maggie's dignity and grace. Shame at his own past cowardice. And something else. Something that made his chest ache when he watched her with the children. A longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Reverend Cole approached as the families began to disperse. "It does my heart good to see you here," he said quietly to Noel. "Both of you." "Much obliged for the welcome," Noel managed. "You'll come again?" The preacher's question was gentle, not demanding. Before Noel could answer, Maggie joined them. "We surely will," she said, her hand finding Noel's arm. "Won't we?" Something in her touch, in her quiet confidence, helped him find his voice. "Reckon so," he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. The ride home was peaceful, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow. They were halfway up the mountain when Maggie broke the comfortable silence. "I want you to know something," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I didn't come here just because of a contract." Noel glanced at her, surprised by the serious tone. "I prayed about it long and hard," she continued. "Asked the Lord to show me his will. And he led me here, to you." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I consider myself your wife not just by paper, but by God's design." The mule's hooves crunched steadily in the snow as Noel absorbed her words. They stirred something deep in his soul, something he'd thought long dead. "I ain't worthy of such faith," he said finally, his voice rough. "That's not for you to decide," Maggie answered simply. "The Lord knows what he's about." They rode on in silence, but something had shifted between them. Noel found himself thinking of the children at church, of Maggie's gentle blessings. He thought of empty rooms in his cabin that could be filled with life, with family. For the first time in years, he felt hope unfurling in his heart, tentative as spring's first shoots but growing stronger by the moment. He wasn't ready to speak of it yet, but when Maggie's hand found his on the reins, he didn't pull away. The cabin came into view, smoke rising straight and true from the chimney into the crystal air. Noel helped Maggie down from the sled, noting how natural it felt now to touch her, to work alongside her. She smiled at him, her face glowing with more than just the cold air, and headed inside to start dinner. Noel stayed out a moment longer, looking at his home with new eyes. It wasn't just a shelter anymore, a place to hide from the world. With Maggie there, it was becoming something else entirely, a place where hope could take root and grow. The weeks following their church visit brought changes as gentle as spring thaw. Winter's grip began to loosen, and with it, the ice around Noel's heart melted too. Each day revealed new aspects of their shared life, small moments that built upon each other like stones in a wall. Maggie proved herself as skilled with a rifle as she was with a cooking pot. One crisp morning, she accompanied Noel on his hunting rounds, her tall form moving silently through the trees. When a deer appeared at the edge of a clearing, she took aim with steady hands. "Wait," Noel whispered, but she had already squeezed the trigger. The shot rang true, and the deer dropped cleanly. "My father taught all his children to hunt," she explained as they field-dressed the deer together. "Said empty bellies don't care if you're a girl or boy." Noel found himself smiling more, speaking more. Words that had rusted shut in his throat came easier now. They worked side by side, mending fences damaged by winter storms, their breath clouding in the cold air. Maggie's strength matched his own, and her clever hands found ways to improve his rough repairs. "See here," she'd say, showing him a better knot or a sturdier brace. "This'll hold through any weather." In the evenings, they sat by the fire, the cabin warm with cooking smells and shared stories. Maggie told tales of her childhood in Ireland, of crossing the ocean, of finding her way in a new land. Noel listened, treasuring each detail she shared. "Never thought I'd find peace in these mountains," she admitted one night, her hands busy with mending. "But the Lord works in mysterious ways." Noel watched her work, the firelight catching the copper threads in her hair. Something had been growing in his heart, taking root like a seedling in spring soil. He'd been carving in secret moments, working pieces of pine wood with careful hands. One evening, after supper was cleared away, he pulled the wrapped bundle from its hiding place. His hands trembled slightly as he held it out to her. "Ain't much," he said gruffly, "but you deserve something finer than what I can give." Maggie unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside lay a wooden comb, each tooth carved with patience and care. The handle bore a simple pattern of leaves and vines, polished smooth as silk. "Oh," she breathed, running her fingers over the design. Tears welled in her eyes, catching the lamplight. "Noel, it's beautiful. Just thought, your hair being so pretty and all." He stumbled over the words, face flushing. Maggie held the comb close to her heart. "No one's ever made me something so fine," she whispered. "Thank you." The moment hung between them, full of unspoken feelings. Noel wanted to tell her how she'd changed his life, how her presence filled empty spaces he hadn't known were aching, but the words stuck in his throat, too big to voice. As February drew to a close, Maggie suggested another visit to town for Sunday service. Noel agreed more readily this time, finding he missed the community he'd once shunned. The morning dawned clear and cold, the sky a bowl of perfect blue. They arrived early, and Reverend Cole greeted them warmly. "Brother Boone, Sister Maggie," he said, clasping their hands. "You bring joy to an old preacher's heart." The church filled slowly, and Noel noticed fewer stares, more genuine smiles. Children waved to Maggie, and several women stopped to chat. They had become familiar faces now, no longer objects of curiosity or scorn. Reverend Cole's sermon that day centered on covenant vows. He spoke of promises made before God, of the sacred bond between husband and wife. His words seemed aimed straight at Noel's heart. "A covenant is more than a contract," the preacher said, his voice carrying to the rafters. "It is a holy promise, sealed by love and witnessed by God himself." Noel felt each word like a hammer striking iron. He thought of the mail-order bride contract, now seemed so cold and formal compared to what had grown between them. He thought of Maggie's patience, her strength, her unwavering faith in him. When the final hymn ended, Noel remained standing. His heart pounded, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Reverend," he called out, drawing all eyes to him. "If you'd permit it, I'd like to speak." Cole nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Of course, Brother Boone." Noel turned to Maggie, taking her work-roughened hand in his. "When you first came, I was a broken man. Thought I didn't deserve no happiness, no peace." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "But you showed me different. Showed me what real strength looks like, not in fists or guns, but in kindness and faith." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant as sunrise. "Would you stand with me at the altar?" Noel asked. "Not because of no contract, but because I love you, plain and true." "Yes," Maggie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "1,000 times yes." They moved to the altar together, Reverend Cole beaming as he opened his Bible. The congregation sat in respectful silence as the preacher spoke the ancient words. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the confirmation of sacred vows between Noel Boone and Magnolia Quinn." Noel's voice was clear and strong as he repeated his vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish. Maggie's responses rang with joy and certainty. When they exchanged rings, simple bands Noel had carried in his pocket, hoping for this moment, their hands were steady. "What God has joined together let no man put asunder," Reverend Cole proclaimed. "I now pronounce you husband and wife, joined not just by law but by love." As if by some holy signal, the congregation burst into song, a spontaneous rendering of amazing grace. Voices lifted to the rafters, many faces wet with tears. Maggie's hand was warm in Noel's as they turned to face their neighbors, no longer strangers, but family in faith. The morning sun streamed through the windows, painting everything in gold. Noel looked at his wife, truly his wife now, in every way that mattered, and saw their future in her smile. The path ahead might hold challenges, but they would face them together, bound by something stronger than any contract. The sunset painted the mountain peaks in shades of amber and rose, a beautiful end to what should have been the happiest day of their lives. Noel and Maggie returned to their cabin after the wedding ceremony, hearts full of joy and promise. They shared a simple supper of venison stew and fresh bread, talking softly about their plans for spring planting. The peace shattered with the thunder of hooves. Shouts echoed from the direction of town, carried on the winter wind. Noel grabbed his rifle, and Maggie wrapped herself in her heavy cloak. They hitched the mule to the wagon with practiced speed, the animal sensing their urgency. "Something's wrong," Noel said, his voice tight. "I can smell smoke." The closer they got to town, the more obvious it became that this was no accident. Orange flames reached toward the night sky, casting demonic shadows across the snow. The wooden church, their sanctuary of just hours before, blazed like a funeral pyre. Horses wheeled in the firelight, their riders mere silhouettes against the inferno. Railroad men, at least 8 of them, shouting and laughing as townspeople scrambled to form a bucket line from the town well. "Dear Lord in heaven," Maggie whispered, crossing herself. They heard children crying, women screaming. Through the chaos, Noel spotted young Timothy, the blacksmith's son, trying to dodge between the horses. One of the animals reared, startled by a falling timber. The boy went down with a terrible cry. Without thinking, Noel leaped from the wagon. He ducked under stamping hooves, scooped up the child, and carried him to safety. The boy's leg bent at an unnatural angle, his face white with pain. "My son!" Sarah Albright pushed through the crowd, taking Timothy into her arms. "He's hurt bad, Noel." Real bad. Maggie was already there, her trained eye assessing the break. "We need to splint it proper," she said, voice steady despite the terror around them. "Sarah, get him inside the store. I'll tend to him." A harsh laugh cut through the crackle of flames. "Look here, boys!" The giants giving orders now. Jeb Tanner sat his horse at the edge of the chaos, a torch still smoking in his hand. His face glowed with malicious satisfaction in the firelight. "This is what happens when folk get ideas above their station," he called out. "When hermits and freaks think they can turn honest citizens against. Progress," he spat into the snow. "You brought this on yourselves, Boone. You and your monster bride." Noel's hands clenched into fists. But before he could move, Maggie's voice rang out, clear as a church bell. "The only monster here is the man who'd burned God's house and harmed children to fill his pockets," she declared. Even in the hellish light, she stood tall and unafraid. Tanner's face twisted. "Shut your mouth, you—" "The Lord sees your works," Maggie continued, cutting him off. "Every timber you burn, every child you harm. He marks it all." Some of the railroad men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Faith ran deep in these mountains, and Maggie's words struck home. "Enough!" Tanner wheeled his horse around. "Let this be a lesson, folks. Progress is coming, whether you want it or not. Next time, it might not just be the church that burns." The riders galloped away, leaving destruction in their wake. The townspeople worked through the night, but it was hopeless. By dawn, their beloved church was nothing but smoking ruins. Noel stood in the ashes, staring at the charred remains of the altar where he'd pledged his love just hours before. Guilt crushed his chest like a mountain of stone. If he hadn't insisted on the wedding, if he'd kept to himself like before. "Noel." Maggie touched his arm gently. "This isn't your fault." "Isn't it?" His voice came out, harsh, bitter. "Tanner said it plain enough. I brought this down on everyone. On you. You can't believe— Look around." He gestured at the devastation. "The church is gone. Timothy's leg might never heal, right? And it's all because I was selfish enough to think I deserved happiness." Maggie tried to embrace him, but he stepped away. "You deserve better than this, Maggie. Better than a man who brings nothing but ruin." "Stop this," she pleaded. "The Lord brought us together for a reason." "The Lord?" Noel laughed, a broken sound. "Where was he when his house burned? When that boy was screaming?" Tears streamed down Maggie's face, but her voice remained strong. "He was in your arms when you saved that child. He was in every bucket passed hand to hand. He's here now, if you'd only see it." But Noel couldn't see past his guilt, couldn't feel anything but the weight of responsibility crushing him. His next words came out like stones. "You need to go." "What?" "Stay with Sarah and the children. They need help with Timothy anyway." He couldn't meet her eyes. "It's not safe with me anymore." "Noel Boone, you listen to me? Please." His voice cracked. "Just go. Before anything worse happens." Maggie stood silent for a long moment, her shadow tall across the snow. Finally, she spoke softly. "I'll go. Not because you're right, but because you're hurting too much to see clear right now. But hear me well, husband. This isn't the end of us." She turned and walked away, her steps heavy but dignified. Noel watched until she disappeared into Sarah's house and then sank to his knees in the ashes of their wedding church. The rising sun cast long shadows across the ruined sanctuary, where, just hours ago, hymns had risen in joy. Now only the whisper of winter wind remained. Noel stayed there, surrounded by the consequences of his happiness, believing with every breath that he'd been right to send away the one person who had taught him to hope again. Around him, the town stirred to life. People began clearing debris, making plans to rebuild. But Noel remained lost in his private darkness, convinced that love and redemption were luxuries he'd been foolish to reach for. The warmth of Maggie's presence, so recently promised to him forever, now felt like a dream he had no right to remember. The wound of her absence began immediately, a physical ache in his chest. But he hardened himself against it, telling himself this pain was better than watching her suffer for loving him. Better than seeing her bright spirit dimmed by association with a man who brought only shadow and flame. As the morning wore on, he finally stood, his legs stiff from kneeling in the cold. Without looking back at the town or the house where Maggie now stayed, he began the long walk home to his cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last, carrying him away from everything he'd dared to want, everything he'd briefly believed he could have. The sun climbed higher, but Noel felt no warmth. He had chosen solitude again, thinking it would protect those he loved. But, in his heart, he knew he'd made a terrible mistake. The question was whether he would realize it in time, or if his fear would cost him the greatest blessing he'd ever known. The mountain winds howled like mournful spirits as Noel trudged through knee-deep snow toward his cabin. 3 days had passed since the church burning, 3 days since he had sent Maggie away. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted down by grief and guilt. Inside the cabin, shadows crept along empty walls. The space felt hollow now, devoid of Maggie's warmth and presence. Her absence screamed from every corner, the neatly stacked quilts she had mended, the spotless dishes she had arranged, the herbs she had dried and hung from the rafters. Better this way, Noel muttered, though the words rang false even to his own ears. He began pulling supplies from shelves, stuffing them into his old trail pack. Dried meat, ammunition, flint and steel, spare clothing. The familiar motions of preparing for the trail brought no comfort this time. Leaving will spare her, he told himself, voice rough in the silence. Spare everyone. His hands moved mechanically, gathering the tools of survival he had relied on during his years alone, before Maggie had arrived with her quiet strength and unshakable faith. The afternoon light dimmed as clouds gathered outside. Noel paused in his packing, surveying the cabin one last time. His gaze fell on something that made his breath catch. Maggie's Bible, lying open on the crude wooden table where she had left it. He approached slowly, as if the book might vanish like a mirage. The leather binding was worn smooth from years of handling, the pages marked with pressed flowers and carefully written notes in Maggie's neat hand. An oil lamp still sat beside it, waiting to illuminate evening prayers that would no longer be spoken here. Almost against his will, Noel found himself drawn to the open pages. His finger traced the verses Maggie had marked in Isaiah. Enlarge the place of thy tent, and let them stretch forth the curtains of thine habitations. Spare not, lengthen thy cords, and strengthen thy stakes. For thou shalt break forth on the right hand and on the left. The words seemed to burn into his mind. He read them again and again, each repetition striking deeper. Maggie had left this passage open deliberately, he realized. A message, meant for him to find. Enlarge the place of thy tent, he whispered. Not run, not hide, not abandon what God had given. Enlarge, strengthen, break forth. Outside, snow began to fall in thick, silent flakes. Noel sank into Maggie's chair, the Bible heavy in his hands. Hours passed as he sat motionless, watching darkness gather while the verses echoed in his thoughts. When sleep finally claimed him, his dreams were vivid and strange. He saw Maggie standing in the midst of flames, but they did not touch her. Her face shone with an inner light as she reached toward him, unafraid. Behind her, a structure rose from ashes, not the old church, but something new and larger, built of fresh-cut timber and hope. The Lord sees your works, dreamed Maggie said, her voice carrying over the roar of fire. The same words she had spoken to Tanner, but now they seemed meant for Noel himself. He woke with the first gray light of dawn, his face wet with tears he did not remember shedding. The Bible still lay open in his lap, its pages glowing faintly in the new day's light. For long moments, Noel sat perfectly still, feeling something shift and settle in his soul. The urge to run had not vanished, but it no longer seemed the only path. Perhaps, he thought, There was more courage in staying than in flight. Slowly, deliberately, he closed the Bible and placed it back on the table. His half-packed trail gear lay scattered around the cabin like abandoned plans. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world clean and white. Noel pulled on his heavy coat and boots. Instead of reaching for his rifle or trapline, he took up his axe. The familiar weight felt different now, not a tool of survival, but one of creation, of repentance. He trudged through the fresh snow to a stand of straight pines he had been saving for repairs. The first bite of the axe into wood rang out across the silent valley. Each stroke felt like a prayer, though Noel had forgotten how to pray with words. Swing after swing, the axe rose and fell. Chips of fresh pine scattered across the snow, fragrant and bright. Noel worked steadily, methodically, letting the rhythm of the labor fill his mind. He was not yet sure what he was building, but he knew it had to be built. The morning wore on. Sweat froze on his brow despite the cold. His arms burned, unused to such sustained work after days of brooding idleness. Still, he did not stop. Each fallen tree felt like a step away from despair, though the path ahead remained unclear. When the sun reached its peak, Noel finally paused to catch his breath. 6 good timber pines lay bucked and ready for squaring. His hands were blistered, his shoulders aching, but his mind felt clearer than it had since the night of the fire. He thought of Maggie again, not as he had last seen her walking away in grief, but as she had stood in his dream. Unafraid of the flames, certain of God's presence even in destruction. She had seen something in him worth believing in, worth fighting for. Perhaps it was time he tried to see it too. The axe felt lighter as he resumed his work. Each stroke now had purpose, though he still could not name it. He was no longer cutting wood to flee into the wilderness. These timbers would build something new, a testimony perhaps to the truth that love was stronger than fear. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, Noel continued his labor of repentance. The steady rhythm of the axe rang through the valley like a bell, calling faithful souls to gather. Though he worked alone, he felt less lonely than he had in all the days since sending Maggie away. The pile of fresh-cut timber grew. Each log represented a choice, not to run, not to hide, not to let guilt and fear drive him from the life God had offered through Maggie's arrival. Whether she would return remained uncertain, but Noel knew he had to prepare a place worthy of her faith in him. "Enlarge the place of thy tent," he murmured, remembering the verses that had transformed his despair into purpose. The words felt like a commission now, a divine instruction he was only beginning to understand. As the light failed, Noel finally lowered his axe. His body ached, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in days. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices between fear and faith. But for now, he had taken the first step away from darkness. He gathered his tools and turned toward the cabin. The windows glowed with the last light of sunset, like embers of hope waiting to be kindled into flame. Inside, Maggie's Bible still lay open on the table, a beacon guiding him home. The widow Sarah Albright's small homestead creaked in the mountain wind. Inside, Maggie sat at the rough-hewn table, her head nearly brushing the low ceiling even while seated. She stared into her cooling cup of chicory coffee, remembering Noel's anguished face as he had sent her away. Sarah's 3 children played quietly in the corner with corn-husk dolls Maggie had made them. The smallest one, Mary, kept sneaking glances at Maggie, as if afraid the giant woman might disappear like a dream. "You ain't gonna let him push you away that easy, are you?" Sarah asked, stirring the pot of bean soup hanging over the hearth. Maggie straightened her spine. "No," she said firmly. "Marriage vows don't break just because a man's afraid." She stood, ducking to avoid the rafters. "I need to speak with Reverend Cole." The walk to the minister's cottage took her past the blackened ruins of the church. Ash still clung to her skirts as she picked her way through the wreckage. The sight strengthened her resolve. Reverend Cole was tending his garden when she arrived, trying to salvage what vegetables remained before Winter's grip tightened. He looked up at her approach, offering a warm smile despite the worry lines creasing his face. "Sister Maggie," he said, brushing dirt from his hands. "I've been praying for you and Noel." Inside his humble home, over cups of herb tea, Maggie poured out her heart. The minister listened intently, nodding at times, his weathered Bible open on the table between them. "Fear is a powerful force," he said finally. "But vows made before God are stronger still. They don't dissolve because trouble comes." "The railroad means to take everything," Maggie said. "Not just Noel's Spring, but the heart of this community. We need to stand together." Reverend Cole's eyes brightened. "Perhaps that's exactly what's needed. The townspeople have been cowed by Tanner's threats, but united—" He paused thoughtfully. "Would you be willing to speak to them? Tomorrow? In the churchyard?" Maggie's heart quickened. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Send word to everyone who'll listen." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Maggie stood in the charred remains of the church, snow crunching beneath her boots. Slowly people began to gather, first Sarah and her children, then others. Some who had once mocked her size now looked up at her with something like hope. Maggie waited until the crowd grew still. Her voice, strong from years of outer work, carried easily across the yard. "Look around you," she began, gesturing at the burnt timbers. "This is what fear does. It destroys. It divides. But God gave us something stronger than fear. Gave us each other." She saw faces beginning to lift, eyes meeting hers. "The railroad thinks it can bully us because we're small folk. But I stand before you as living proof that God loves all sizes." A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the crowd. "He gave us this land, this water, these mountains, not to hide in, but to build upon." More townspeople arrived, drawn by her words. Even those who had jeered at her height now pressed closer to listen. "My husband," her voice caught slightly, but she pressed on, "believes he must run to protect us. But running never protected anyone. We must stand together, or we'll fall alone." Reverend Cole stepped forward. "Sister Maggie speaks truth. Our strength lies not in our size, but in our unity." Maggie raised her hands. "Let us pray together, not for vengeance, but for courage, for wisdom, for the strength to defend what's right." The crowd bowed their heads as Maggie's clear voice lifted in prayer. Even those who had come to scoff found themselves joining in the amens. As the prayer ended, a group of men who had once worked their own farms before the railroad drove them out stepped forward. The oldest, his face weathered as old leather, spoke up. "If Boone will stand his ground, we'll stand with him," he declared. Others nodded firmly. "We've lost enough to Tanner's greed." Maggie's heart swelled with hope. She looked at the faces around her, no longer seeing mockery or fear, but determination and unity. "I'll go to him," she said. "Tonight, we'll face this together as God intended." The gathered townspeople dispersed slowly, but something had changed. Where before there had been defeated silence, now there was purpose. Where there had been isolation, now there was community. Sarah touched Maggie's arm. "You showed us what courage looks like," she said softly. "Standing tall ain't just about height." Maggie smiled, but her mind was already turning toward the mountain cabin where Noel waited. She would not let him face his demons alone. God had brought them together for this moment, and together they would remain. The eastern sky blushed pink as Maggie guided her borrowed mule up the snow-dusted mountain trail. The animal's breath steamed in the crisp dawn air, hooves crunching through patches of ice. She had borrowed the gentle beast from Sarah, who understood that some journeys couldn't wait. The familiar shape of Noel's cabin emerged through the pine trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the sound of rhythmic chopping echoed across the clearing. Maggie's heart quickened as she drew closer. Noel stood amid a scatter of fresh-cut logs, his axe rising and falling in steady strokes. He had stripped to his shirt despite the cold, and sweat gleamed on his forehead. He paused mid-swing when he heard the mules approach, his face tightening with emotion. "Maggie," he said hoarsely, lowering the axe, "you shouldn't have come back." She dismounted carefully, her tall frame unfolding to its full height. "I go where the Lord leads me," she replied, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "And He led me here." Noel turned away, gesturing at the logs. "I'm fixing what I can before I leave. The cabin will be yours if you want it." "No." Maggie's voice rang with conviction. "Running won't solve anything, Noel Boone. You know that in your heart." He whirled to face her, eyes blazing. "You'll be safer if I go. The railroad men. They won't stop. Safety without honor is no life at all," Maggie cut in, drawing herself up to her full, impressive height. "And what of our vows? What of the townspeople who need this spring?" Noel flinched. "The town? They've shown nothing but scorn. They've changed." Maggie stepped closer, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. "Look, these are the names of folks willing to stand with us. Sarah Albright, Reverend Cole, the Thompsons, even old Jake Miller, who lost his farm to the railroad last year." Noel took the paper with trembling hands, reading the signatures. His shoulders sagged. "I never thought—" "God doesn't ask us to fight alone," Maggie said softly. She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. "Tell me true, Noel. What really frightens you?" The morning wind whispered through the pines as Noel struggled with words. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. "Not the railroad." "Not really." He met her eyes. "I'm afraid of failing you, of not being the man you deserve." Maggie's heart melted at his confession. She squeezed his calloused hand in both of hers. "God doesn't ask you to be perfect," she said gently. "Only faithful." "And you are faithful, Noel Boone, even when you doubt yourself." Tears glinted in Noel's eyes. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I see your heart." Maggie touched his chest. "A man who didn't care wouldn't ache so deeply." "Come." She tugged his hand. "Let's pray. By the spring." They walked together through the fresh snow to where the spring bubbled up from the earth, its waters crystal clear despite the winter chill. Maggie knelt beside it, drawing Noel down with her. "Lord," she began, her voice carrying on the morning air, "we dedicate this spring to your keeping. These waters you've provided, this land you've blessed us with, help us be worthy stewards. Give us strength to stand together, wisdom to act justly, and faith to trust your guidance." Noel's voice joined hers, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. "Amen." As they rose, Maggie saw something new in Noel's face. A quiet strength that came not from isolation but from unity. He looked at their joined hands, then up at the towering women who had brought such change to his life. "I've been a fool," he said simply. "Perhaps," Maggie smiled. "But you're my fool, bound by holy vows and God's grace. And we'll face whatever comes together." The morning sun broke fully over the mountain peaks, painting the snow in golden light. By the spring that had sparked so much strife, two hearts found their way back to faith, to each other, and to the strength that comes from standing united in the face of adversity. Word raced through the valley like wildfire. The railroad men were gathering forces for a final confrontation. Instead of cowering, wagons began rolling up the snowy path to Noel's cabin at dawn. Men and women arrived carrying shovels, axes, and determination in equal measure. "Never thought I'd see the day," Noel murmured to Maggie as they watched Sarah Albright's boys stack firewood into a defensive wall near the spring. "These same folks who once mocked us, now standing shoulder to shoulder." Maggie smiled, helping two men position a wagon to block the narrow approach. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, my love." Reverend Cole arrived on horseback, his saddlebags bulging with papers. "Before anyone spills blood," he announced, dismounting carefully. "There's something you should see." He pulled out a yellow document, handling it like a holy relic. "My father preserved this deed when he first came to the valley. It sets aside this spring for communal use by treaty with the original settlers." The gathered townsfolk crowded around, murmuring in amazement as Cole explained the legal implications. "This means the railroad can't simply seize it," he said firmly. "The water belongs to all of us." The sound of approaching horses cut through their discussion. Jeb Tanner led a group of armed men into the clearing, their faces hard with contempt. "Well, ain't this touching?" Tanner sneered, looking at the gathered townspeople. "A regular family reunion. We have legal claim to this spring." Reverend Cole stepped forward, holding out the deed. "By treaty and law." Tanner barely glanced at the document. "Paper burns easy enough." "But truth endures," Noel's voice rang out as he stepped to the front, Maggie tall and proud beside him. "This spring sustains our community. We won't yield it, not to threats, not to force." Tension crackled like static before a storm. Hands hovered near pistols. The townsfolk drew closer together, forming a human barrier between the railroad men and the spring. The standoff stretched through the morning hours, neither side willing to back down. The winter sun climbed higher, glinting off rifle barrels and casting long shadows across the snow. Tanner's men shifted restlessly in their saddles while the townsfolk stood firm, shoulder to shoulder. Finally, Tanner spat into the snow. "You realize what you're doing?" he growled, standing against progress itself. "We're standing for what's right," Maggie's clear voice rang out. "And there are witnesses enough here to testify if blood is spilled." Tanner's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the crowd. Dozens of faces stared back, resolute and unafraid. Even the children watched from cabin windows, ready to bear witness. The foreman's jaw worked as he calculated the cost of violence, not just in lives, but in unwanted attention from federal marshals. "Mount up," he barked suddenly to his men. "This ain't worth the powder." As his horse wheeled around, he jabbed a finger at Noel. "We'll be back with papers instead of guns. See how your precious deed holds up in court." Cheers erupted as the railroad men rode away, their horses' hooves churning the snow. Maggie's hand found Noel's, squeezing tight. When he looked up at her, her eyes shone with pride and love. "The Lord provides strength when we stand together," she said softly. In the days that followed, that strength showed itself in wood and nail and shared purpose. Noel led the effort to rebuild the church, his axe ringing through the valley as he cut fresh timber. Maggie worked alongside him, her incredible height proving a blessing, as she lifted heavy beams into place that would have taken 3 men to position. The work drew the community closer. Women brought stews and cornbread to feed the laborers. Children carried water and gathered kindling. Even those who had once mocked Maggie's size now marveled at how she could raise a beam single-handedly, saving hours of complicated rigging. One crisp Sunday morning, the congregation gathered around the half-built frame. Though the walls were not yet complete, the skeleton of their new church rose proud against the sky. Reverend Cole led them in hymns, their voices carrying clear in the mountain air. Noel stood with his arm around Maggie's waist, singing words that now felt true in his heart. Peace settled over him like a warm blanket. Looking at his towering bride, he marveled at God's wisdom. He had been so lost in darkness, but the Lord had sent him someone tall enough to reach down and lift him toward the light. The mountain snows began their slow retreat as March yielded to April. Fresh green buds appeared on the aspens, and songbirds returned to nest in the eaves of Noel and Maggie's cabin. The transformation outside mirrored the change within their home's log walls. Where silence once ruled, laughter now echoed. Sarah Albright's children had become regular visitors, their small boots leaving muddy prints by the door. They would rush in after school, eager to see what new wooden animal Noel might be carving or what treat Maggie had baked in her cast-iron stove. On this particular evening, the cabin glowed with warmth and fellowship. Sarah's youngest daughter, Emma, sat on a wool blanket by the hearth, cradling a freshly carved wooden deer. Her brothers played checkers at the rough-hewn table, while Maggie's voice lifted in song, teaching them an old Irish hymn. The tune spoke of God's faithfulness through storms, and the children's voices joined in on the chorus, sweet and clear. Noel's hands moved steadily over a new piece of pine, shaping it into a tiny horse. Woodchips gathered at his feet as he watched his wife lead the singing. Her head nearly brushed the ceiling beams when she stood, but she moved with a grace that made her sighs seem natural, even beautiful. The lamplight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, and her face glowed with contentment. After supper, when Sarah had gathered her sleepy children and headed home, Noel touched Maggie's elbow. "Come outside with me a spell," he said softly. They stepped out onto the porch, where the evening air carried the scent of pine and early spring flowers. Above them, stars scattered across the dark sky like diamond dust, and the mountains stood as ancient guardians against the horizon. Maggie's shoulder brushed against his as they gazed upward together. "You know," Noel said thoughtfully, "when you first arrived, I feared you would overshadow me. Thought folks would laugh to see a man with a wife so tall." He turned to look at her, his eyes bright with emotion. "But now I see clear as day. You were God's miracle, sent to lift me higher than I could ever reach alone." Maggie smiled, her large hand finding his and holding it gently. Through the cabin window, lamplight spilled out warm and golden, and the last notes of a hymn drifted on the evening air. The sound of children's laughter echoed from within, a reminder of how much had changed. "I paid for a bride," Noel whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "But God gave me a miracle." They stood together in comfortable silence, their joined shadows stretching long across the porch as laughter continued to ring from their home. No longer a hermit's refuge, but a sanctuary of love and faith beneath the watchful mountains. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.